Good morning, folks. The subject of today's lecture I am calling Consequentialism Part 1. There are two chapters concerning consequentialism in the textbook, The Fundamentals of Ethics. The corresponding reading is a classic explaining and arguing for utilitarianism by John Stuart Mill. I will be making some references to John Stuart Mill's older contemporary, Jeremy Bentham, today, who's actually not discussed in the text. However, laying some of Bentham's groundwork might explain some of the rationale behind utilitarianism a little better. So that is part of why I will be incorporating that into today's conversation. Now, I framed this first part as a question. How do consequentialist approaches to normative ethics define the moral point of view of right and wrong conduct? Now, simply put, we call these theories consequentialists because right conduct is determined by the consequences. Good reason to call it consequentialism. To put it another way, your intentions are not what counts according to consequentialism. In other words, the net results of your behaviors are what determine whether or not you'll fulfill the duties of morality or not. Consequentialism. Now, note that the main focus of these chapters will be upon one of the most popular and well-known versions of consequentialist approaches, and that will be called Act Utilitarianism. Now, I want to speak briefly about this word utility. You'll see it in John Stuart Mill. But the word utility is synonymous with happiness. And remember, we already discussed John Stuart Mill. How does John Stuart Mill define happiness? Remember, he was a moderate hedonist. Utility equals happiness, and happiness equals pleasure. But do keep in mind when they are talking about pleasure, they are not talking about banal physical pleasure. They are talking about that moderate hedonism that might better be defined as overall well-being. So this is how happiness is defined. You ought to pursue, and I'll say this right here, here are several general ways of explaining the Act Utilitarian approach. First, you ought to pursue those actions whose results are optimistic. If you read the text, you saw this word optimistic in bold. Remember it. It's really a difficult word to pronounce, perhaps, for some folks, but the meaning is pretty simple. If something is optimum, if something is optimistic, we mean that it produces the best overall results in terms of happiness. Let me continue. Another way of putting it, to act such as to promote the general welfare. If you don't like that word welfare, substitute well-being. Act to promote the general well-being. Now, finally, and this is probably the best known way of framing the principle of utility, as it's called. Act to promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, I already explained what was meant by utility, so I don't have to come back to this bullet point again. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what optimistic, acting to promote the greatest good for the greatest number of people amounts to. The idea here is, folks, that whenever you're trying to determine what the moral point of view is, what moral actions are, you're supposed to you're supposed to ask yourself, how will my actions not just affect me, but how are my actions going to affect? And here's the way the author of the textbook put it. He said, how are my actions going to affect everyone in the world? I hope some of you saw that. I just put it, everyone. In other words, to do a proper utilitarian analysis, you're supposed to ask yourself, what kinds of actions on my part will promote the general welfare? And whatever actions will, in fact, produce the greatest good for the greatest number of people is the moral thing to do. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a minute in more detail. But I already explained here, and I've already used this word more than once in the course, but I'm going to use it again. The author of the text instead uses the phrase the moral community. You might hear other philosophers use this term, stakeholders. It's also a term that's sometimes used in economics and legal matters. A stakeholder refers to anyone whose interests count, anyone who will be affected is technically a stakeholder according to utilitarianism. It does not matter if they live next door to me or if they live halfway around the world for me. They are individuals who are, in fact, stakeholders. We're in Pennsylvania right now. Our friends in California's interests, or even not our friends, people we don't know, interests ought to be taken into account when we are deciding what we ought to do. In other words, everybody's interest matters according to utilitarianism. Absolutely everyone, not just whom. Not just the people we love and care about. And also not just the people that we have direct duties to. Now, what I mean by direct duties is something like this. I certainly have direct duties to my wife that are different from my direct duties to you folks. I have direct duties to my children, which are not the same duties as I have to you folks, and so forth. And by the way, my direct duties to you folks are actually different from my direct duties to other ACT students, because you're what? Because you're in my class. However, I technically also have duties to other students. And somebody says, hey, I have a question for you. Well, guess what I do? I do my best to answer. I would say, you're not my student, get out of here. That's not my approach. Now, technically, I have duties to everyone according to utilitarianism. Everybody's interest matters. And I'll come back to this in more detail. But that is sometimes viewed as both a positive point of this theory. It's also viewed as something that might have negative or difficulties associated with it. Now, I want to come back to a little bit of background. It's actually not so much in the text, even though it is alluded to in the reading from John Stuart Mill in the text, in the reader textbook. The father of what is known as simple utilitarianism is a 19th century philosopher by the name of Jeremy Bentham. Bentham was a contemporary of John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill. Now, Bentham, in his argument for utilitarianism, will take for granted that the hedonist account of happiness is the most plausible account of happiness. Because the understanding is that we are in fact a part of nature. We are human animals. And as animals, we first and foremost have an interest in surviving, but not just survive, just not surviving, but to survive well. In other words, all of us want to be happy. And most of us, even if we don't 100% agree that hedonism is all there is to happiness, most people do believe that we want basic comforts, we don't want to be harmed, we don't want to be constantly scared that things are going to go bad for us. These are all things that a hedonist would say are pieces of the happiness puzzle. So from the starting point, hedonism is at the foreground of the utilitarian approach. Now, Bentham formulates something, and this won't be on the test. He formulates what he calls the felicific calculus. Now, folks, this word felicity is kind of archaic, it's out of style. It's really just an old-fashioned word for pleasure. So calling it the felicific calculus simply means, the pleasure calculus. Now, what the felicific calculus does, and granted, take this with a grain of salt, its aim is to find something like a quasi-scientific formula for determining what actions we ought to take. In order to do what? In order to maximize our happiness. Now, Bentham starts with what I might call a most banal account of human nature. He admits that the psychological egoist might be right, and that we may really just be so selfish that we're really ultimately just concerned about what? Our own selfish interests. In other words, I am ultimately most concerned about my happiness. Now, the first 6 criteria in his pleasure calculus are centered around thinking about individual happiness. But he asks questions like, how much pleasure will it produce? Typically, if something produces more pleasure, we'd rather do that than do something that produces less. If I do this pleasurable thing, how likely is it that it will be accompanied by pain? If I do this pleasurable thing, how likely is it going to be that it will improve my happiness in the long run? These are the kind of questions that are broached by his felicific calculus. Now, after he goes through 6 points that are related to individuals attaining pleasure, his criterion number 7, and you don't have to know this word, but he contends that in order to be happy ourselves, or I should say, to figure out what will make us happy, we also need to consider the extent of our actions. Now, what he means by extent is, how is my doing X going to affect other people? Other people who are also trying to do what? Seek happiness just like me. How is my action going to affect other people? Now remember, I said that he started by assuming that we were selfish beasts. But he demonstrates that if we are effective selfish beasts when it comes to making ourselves happy, it is in our interest to look out not just for ourselves, but to look out for other people. And I want to make this extremely simple so it will be understood. The understanding is that we are members of a what? We are members of communities. I do not live by myself on an island. If I lived by myself on an island, I wouldn't need to consider other people because there wouldn't be other people to consider. However, we live in communities among other people. The way that other people behave affects us. The way we behave affects other people. Thus, if I actually want my long-term self-interest to be maximized, I actually have an interest in not just looking out for myself, but also for looking out for other people. Now, what's interesting here is he starts from a point of egoism. And he argues, in effect, that to be an effective egoist, you technically have to behave like a what? He assumes the worst of us, that we might be egoists. Because the fact is, we do want to make ourselves happy. It's true. But in order to be an effective egoist, you have to act like an In order to become an effective egoist, you actually have to act like an altruist. Why? Because altruism pays dividends. Because if you look out for other people, they are more likely to also take your interests seriously too. So from what we would call selfish starting points, he ends up arguing for a position that is sometimes called reciprocal altruism. Reciprocal meaning, yeah, you behave altruistically, understanding that it will be in your long-term best interest in terms of your odds of getting it back. This is why pure altruists would actually say this isn't real altruism. A pure altruist would say this isn't real altruism because the motivation at root is fundamentally egoistic. Guess what Bentham would say? So what? Do intentions really matter that much, given that at the end of the day, if we want to be happy, what we want are results? Consequences. Yeah, this is why utilitarianism, even though it gets us to recognize that it behooves us to behave like an altruist, critics would contend it's not real altruism if your beginning motive is getting happy yourself. Does that make pretty good sense? Now, I already talked about what's meant by utility. Now, because of the detail I went into there, I should be able to make short order of the next couple of bullet points, fortunately. I have the bullet point actual outcomes versus expected outcomes. Now, folks, keep this in mind. The main thrust of utilitarianism is that what produces the best actual outcomes is, in fact, the moral thing. Now, the problem is, some critics suggest this might be a problem. Suppose that a person does a very good job of predicting what the net outcomes are going to be, but perhaps some things get in the way. The person actually did try her best to be a good utilitarian. It's just that she got the calculations wrong. Shouldn't we give her a utilitarian gold star anyway, for at least having done the best she could to go through the utilitarian calculus? Now, of course, from a strict standpoint, the utilitarian would say, no, actual outcomes don't really define morality. Intended outcomes do not. Because remember, utilitarians do not divorce in the area of intention. But let me give you an example that is not in the textbook to try to get a little deeper into this problem. How many of you remember Fox Television's right-wing terrorism drama 24, starring Kiefer Sutherland as Agent Jack Bauer? In one of the episodes, I think it was episode 3, they were getting near the end of the season. I'll give you the gist of it so you understand the scenario. Some terrorist has a suitcase nuke. The plan is to blow up Los Angeles. And of course, Jack Bauer and his team are supposed to do what? Their goal is to stop the terrorists. Now, I'll make one little quasi-utilitarian remark before I get fully into the scenario. In general, stopping that suitcase nuke from going off ought to be stopped by what? Any means necessary. Because in fact, if something is likely to kill over 1 million people, that is something that ought to be stopped, regardless of what kind of actions you may have to engage in. I think you know where I'm going here. Jack Bauer uncovered part of the plot. It turns out that one of his former people who he worked with, who I guess owns a military industrial contracting company, played by the actor John Voight, he actually had this plan that he had hoped that the nuke would do what? That it would go off, so it would set off a what? Basically, what would we call it? A new Pearl Harbor. In other words, a reason for the U.S. to regain its position in the world as a global superpower. This man had no problem with 1 million people dying in order to get America back to its superpower status, or at least to try to claim its superpower status. Of course, he sounds like he thought of himself as a great patriot, by the way, albeit a diabolical patriot, because he was willing to do what? Sacrifice as many lives as possible in order to make the dream a reality. So anyway, Jack Bauer gets into the house where the guy is with his wife. Now, of course, he thinks to himself, I've got to get the information from this guy because I know that he has it. So guess what he first thinks he's going to do? Oops, bad spelling. Torture the guy who basically has the information related to the ticking time bomb terrorist. Famous scenario here. Now, the problem is, he knows that this guy has also had CIA training. In other words, he could withstand any amount of torture, and he still wouldn't what? Yeah, he still wouldn't break. He wouldn't give up the information. So Jack Bauer's got an idea. The man loves his wife, of course, and his wife is right next to him on the sofa. He says, I'll shoot her knee out! You know, in other words, what he will do is he will shoot the man's wife's knee out. Guess what Jack Bauer does? He says, I'm not going to tell you where it is. He blows her knee out. Now, of course, Jack Bauer's like, well, I'm going to torture her. And the guy just laughs. He says, no matter what you do, I'm not going to give you the information. Now, this is definitely grounds for divorce. I hope good. I got a couple of laughs there. But the point is, Jack Bauer was actually doing something that he expected would get the guy to give up the information. In other words, he threatened to harm a loved one. He threatened to torture a loved one. Now, for the most part, most of us might say, what about torture? Torture in general is not a good thing. But from a strict utilitarian standpoint, if torturing one innocent person in order to save 1 million innocent lives, is what needs to be done. It is not just what needs to be done. Torture would actually be moral in this situation. I'll repeat that. Torture would be the moral point of view in this situation if it would indeed save 1 million lives. Similar scenario. How many of you have seen the film The Imitation Game? Now, admittedly, they took a lot of creative license here. But the scenario is that the British code breakers succeeded in breaking the Nazi code so they could be one step ahead. The problem is, much of their one step ahead information let them know what targets the Nazis would be hitting. From a utilitarian standpoint, guess what they couldn't do? They could not prevent those bombings from taking place. Because as soon as you take action to prevent those bombings to take place, the Germans would have known that the code was broken and all of the strategic advantages would be lost. So in order to save more lives in the long run and to hasten the end of the war more quickly, the idea is that it was the moral point of view from a utilitarian standpoint to let people be killed by Nazi bombings. It ain't pretty, folks. Nobody says it's pretty. As a matter of fact, a utilitarian would say it is unfortunate. However, the moral point of view is you need to do whatever will maximize overall well-being. Eggs must be broken, to use that cliche. In other words, sometimes unwanted harms must be either allowed, or in some cases, perhaps harms must be done in order to maximize overall well-being. Now, I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself intentionally by use of this example. One of the criticisms that we'll see of utilitarianism when we move forward is utilitarianism ultimately contends that there are no actions that are inherently wrong in and of themselves. Why? Because right and wrong are determined on a case-by-case basis, depending upon what will end up maximizing overall well-being. Most of us balk from saying that torture is ever moral. Many of you might say that torture is sometimes acceptable and the lesser of evils. But many of you would probably say it's not moral. Well, guess what? Utilitarianism, because of the way it defines the good, would say torture is indeed moral in those situations where it will maximize well-being. Many people think that there is something inherently wrong with telling lies. The utilitarian would say there is nothing inherently wrong with lying, even though lying in general does not do what? Yeah, I happen to think in general, lying does not promote overall well-being. But if you're in a situation where it would promote overall well-being, then telling a lie in that situation wouldn't just be the lesser of two evils. It would be deemed moral. Some people have difficulty with ever calling certain actions moral. You get what I mean here? Some people have difficulty. I'll admit I am one of those people. Yeah, may as well admit things, right? Now, some of the attractions of utilitarianism, I'm just going to go through this laundry list. When properly applied, it is highly impartial. By this, I mean every single person's interests are meant to count equally. As a matter of fact, you're not supposed to count your own interests as any more important than anyone else's. Now let me go all nerd on you. One of those quintessential movie examples of this. And the funny thing is, there was kind of discussion about this surrounding nuclear accidents on NPR just the other day. In Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, there is a nuclear reactor problem on the Starship Enterprise. Yeah, it's fictional, sorry. But you can imagine the things of fiction being relatable to real life scenarios. Now, Mr. Spock, the second in command, knows what needs to be done in order to stop the meltdown from occurring. He understands that no action is taken, that the Enterprise will be destroyed and everyone on the ship will die. Very bad result. So guess what Mr. Spock does? He opens the hatch, he goes in, he solves the problem, but radiation sickness. In other words, he sacrifices his life He sacrifices his own life for the entire crew. From a utilitarian standpoint, folks, he did the right thing. And they have his character making that famous line, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. That is a quintessentially utilitarian way of looking at the problem. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And by the way, if you were in that situation from a utilitarian standpoint, you should what? You should do the same thing. Or let's go back to those trolley car thought experiments. Remember those? Now suppose there is a trolley car out of control. There are 10 workers who will be hit if nothing is done. I can't throw the switch. I am on the overpass. But I recognize that if I jump and get splattered all over the place, that the workers will notice it. And you have to bear with me. It is the only way I can do it. Utilitarianism would say I have a duty to do what? Dude, you have a duty to jump and be splattered all over the place. Why? Because 10 innocent human lives are more important than what? Than one. Punchline. Some critics say that because of scenarios like this, utilitarianism seems to demand too much of us. Because you'll notice that it seems to demand radical selflessness if that act of selflessness ends up leading to the greater good. Now, before I come back to that, the author contends that it tends to confirm most of what we conventionally accept as moral and immoral actions. I kind of already talked about this. In general, it would give a reasonable account of why murder is immoral, slavery is immoral, lying is generally immoral, and so forth. Notice I said generally. Its approach to conflict resolution goes something like this. Analyze the situation carefully, figure out what action will promote the general well-being, and then go ahead and do it. And by the way, folks, according to some people who have lectured and thought about these issues deeply, many people believe that our first moral impulses tend to be utilitarian in nature. In other words, we ask questions like, what course of action is likely to have the best net results? And those are, generally speaking, the kind of things that we ought to want to do. In other words, its approach to moral conflict resolution seems to be consistent with the approach that many of us already to some extent take for granted. Now finally, and this will show up again, the author says one of its other attractions is what he calls its moral flexibility. Now I'll restate what I said before. Remember, according to utilitarianism, Nothing is inherently right or inherently wrong. Right and wrong are determined by the consequences that will result from our action. So utilitarianism argues that we ought to do whatever needs to be done in order to make the outcomes optimistic, even if it means doing something that we would generally call not so nuts. That's what we mean by its moral flexibility. Now, we're going to end fairly soon. I just want to say a few words about. The author talks about the utilitarian account of the moral community. I already talked about this concept of the moral community. We're talking about those individuals whose interests ought to count. Now, I want to make a few caveats that are not in the text. The philosopher Jeremy Bentham in the 19th century was ahead of his time about this. And many of his views are also echoed in the late 1970s by Australian philosopher Peter Singer. Peter Singer wrote a famous book called Animal Rights. Now, Bentham and Singer both held the viewpoint that the interests of animals ought to be taken into account too. And some of your animal-loving friends might actually have bumper stickers with the Jeremy Bentham quote. It says, the question isn't can they think or can they reason. The question is, can they suffer? The question isn't can they think or can they reason. The question is, can they suffer? Jeremy Bentham expands the moral community, stakeholders, to all those beings who could potentially suffer. In other words, the interests of animals also ought to be considered in our utilitarian calculation. And by the way, it was enlightened aristocrats in the 19th century in England, like Bentham, who were doing various kinds of social reform in the interest of reforming child labor, in the interest of promoting things like universal education, and also putting on the books animal cruelty laws, which did not exist before. He includes all beings that can suffer as beings that count. Now, folks, my caveat here is so you don't get the wrong impression. Not all utilitarians are on the same page. There are some utilitarians that are anthropocentrists. I put this word on the board before. An anthropocentrist is a person who believes that only humans ultimately matter. Only human interests matter. Bentham and Singer were not anthropocentrists. But many utilitarians are anthropocentrists. In other words, they think that the only beings that ought to count as genuine stakeholders are in fact human beings. Why? Well, this argument will sound similar to what we talked about before. Because only human beings are technically moral agents. Remember, animals can't have moral relationships with me. I can have a moral relationship with them. This is why many people will say, even if we do count animals' interests as counting at all, it should count as less than for human beings. First, because they're not moral agents, but the other reason is because of this. Because animals do not have the same acute ability for suffering that we do. Because I don't know about you folks, physical pain is not the worst kind of pain from where I'm standing. It is emotional suffering for me that has always been far worse than physical pain. I don't think my dog has the same capacity as that. Now, I'm not saying I agree or disagree with Bentham and Singer here. I'm just saying, these are the kind of arguments that someone might put forth for saying, even if we do count animals' interests, they should be counted for what? For a bit less, generally speaking, than human beings. Now, we're going to stop for now, and we'll pick up where we left off shortly.